Okay, yes, good morning everyone. So, yes, the important articles from the Hindu newspaper, 4th February 2022. Okay, so look at the first page of today's newspaper. You can see that two important developments. Indian diplomats to boycott Beijing Games or Winter Olympic Games. Okay, so the reason here is China has involved the one of its PLA regiment commander who was involved in Galwan clashes as the member of 1200 runners bearing the torch at relay in the Beijing. Okay, and this is protested by India by boycotting this inauguration ceremony and we can say the end ceremony here. Okay, along with that, many other countries like US, UK, Canada, Australia, they have also boycotted the ceremony, but the reason is different for them, the human rights concerns and in Xinjiang and Tibet. Along with that, Austria and Sweden also we can say boycotted the games, but because of COVID-19 protocols. Okay, so though they are sending their players for the games, but the diplomats and the leaders, they are actually boycotting the games. Okay, yes. Now this is important, just you should be having follow up between India-China relations, the tensions along LAC and the 2020 Galwan Valley conflict clashes that had happened, that escalated the tensions between India and China. And now after almost 2 years, basically 1.5 years, the same we can say aspect is brought by China here, and it may again deteriorate the relations between India and China, which had seen in recent times some improvement. Okay. On right hand side, you can see High Court stays Haryana job quota for locals. Okay, so this is again important development when we talk about the regionalism or giving more importance to the local people. So Haryana government had enacted this law which provided for reservation of 75% of jobs in private companies. Although these jobs were up to certain income levels, okay, above that there was no reservation, but this affected to some extent the private companies, as the private companies work on the market forces and on the merit basis. So that's why this was demand by the private companies that it should be we can say taken back, and now the High Court has stayed the implementation. Okay, it has not completely we can say eliminated, rather it has stayed temporarily. Okay, the interim stay is there. Now on bottom side you can see Tamil Nadu governor returns NEET bill to assembly. Now recently we discussed one editorial which talked about the role of governor with respect to government or executive and legislature, and there we discussed 3 such recent examples of the governors like in West Bengal, in Maharashtra and one Tamil Nadu, and in that Tamil Nadu we were talking about this NEET bill which was with governor, and he was not giving back or recommending back that particular bill either to the president or back to the assembly. Now he has acted upon that bill. Okay, so we'll just have the follow up there. Now moving on. Okay, this photograph is there. That photograph is related to news talking about the IS chief was killed here in one of the strikes by the US forces. Okay, so we will have follow up on this news also from security GS3 perspective. Islamic State, IS or ISIS, this has been acting as a threat to peace not only in India but around the world. Okay, so terrorism is important topic in internal security or security part of our syllabus GS3 paper, and there has been questions on ISIS or IS, how it is acting as a threat to India's security. Okay, so just follow up to that aspect, we will discuss that this particular news. Now on page number 6, editorial page, there is one editorial talking about a disjointed response. Okay, so disjointed response, the context of the article here, it is talking about recent budgetary proposal of taxing the crypto transactions and digital we can say assets, buying and selling of digital assets like non-fungible tokens. Okay, so the article mentions here that along with such taxing those transactions, there should be regulatory clarity or regulatory environment clarity on this virtual currency transactions. Okay, so from GS2 paper governance aspect, it is important, regulatory part, regulation aspect. Okay, on page number 10, you can see Chandrayaan 3 set for launch in August. Okay, so this is the new timeline given by the government for launch of Chandrayaan 3. We know that in 2019 Chandrayaan 2 was launched and its rover lander failed to have the soft touch landing on the surface of moon, and because of that the rover could not work there. But now again next effort it's with the similar objectives of Chandrayaan 2 are going to be implemented here through Chandrayaan 3 here. So again we will revise Chandrayaan 2, which were the components of Chandrayaan 2, objectives, mission, and we can say that why Chandrayaan 2 had target of reaching or landing over the south pole of moon. Okay, so that is revision for you for prelims examination. Now on page 11 you can see the news, IS chief blows himself up amid US raid. Okay, so yes, the IS chief Abu Ibrahim al-Hashmi al-Qureshi, so he was killed here. So you should remember that in 2019 the first chief of IS, so just let me tell you the name of the earlier, we can say, chief. He was also killed in the same manner. Yes, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Okay, so he was also killed in the same manner, and now the new chief is also killed in the same manner. Now this is important development to win over the war against the terrorism, especially the IS, which had spread influence beyond West Asia region. Okay, so yes, we will have follow up on this news. And on text and context page, so there is one article discussing the budgetary provisions, especially talking about the macroeconomic aspects of the budget, and it talks about the need of increasing labor income and consumption expenditure, but how the present budget or this year's budget is focusing more on consolidation, fiscal consolidation, by reducing the expenditure, especially the capital expenditure and social sector expenditure. Okay, so from that aspect we will discuss this article, GS3 paper economy part. Yes, so first article, the need to boost labor income and consumption expenditure. Yes, this is what the article I was talking on text and context page. This is very important article because the article analyzes from macroeconomic perspective. We all know that there are 4 drivers of economic growth. 4 drivers of economic growth, which are these: public expenditure, then public consumption, third we can say private consumption, private investment. Okay, public expenditure and investment together we can call it as one. Then private consumption, and fourth one is exports. These are the engines of growth, 4 engines of growth. So generally whenever the government formulates the policies for economic growth of the country, they give emphasis on these four components, four engines of growth. Okay, so the article talks about need to boost this private consumption. At present, this is very low, and also because of pandemic, it has affected the income levels, and because of that, there is very low private consumption levels. The government is focusing more on public investment and exports at present, but they are also having some limitations. We will discuss this aspect here. Now, the context of this article is union budget. This year's budget has projected fiscal deficit of 6.4% of the nominal GDP, narrowing from 6.9% assumed in the revised estimates for the current fiscal. Now, this is in line with fiscal consolidation, reducing the fiscal deficit to 4.5 by 2025-26. This is the present government target for the fiscal deficit reduction. Now, because of, let's say, such policy making, this year's budget has to some extent focused on, we can say, rationalization of its expenditure, especially the capital expenditure is reduced. Let's understand what has happened. What was the economic context to this year's budget formulation? Now, specificity of the present crisis in India lies in the sharper reduction in labor income as compared to profits. So, there is sharper reduction in labor income as compared to profits. When we say profits, we are talking about the corporates and their profits. So, we can see that after 2 years of pandemic, almost we have recovered to the pre-pandemic level in majority of the economic sectors. So, profit is not that much concern. But what we are witnessing is the labor income and private consumption, it has remained to the lower levels. Okay, it has not recovered to the pre-pandemic levels also. Now, the consequent reduction in the income share of the labor was associated with sharp fall in consumption to GDP ratio as well as absolute value of consumption expenditure during the pandemic. Now, we know that when there is lower labor income, so obviously it will result into lower private consumption. The people do not have disposable income available for them to buy the consumer goods, and that's why private consumption decline. Okay, so this is what in line with, we can say that the pandemic, the impact of pandemic. Now, while the GDP in 2021-22 is estimated to attain the pre-pandemic level, this is what we are talking. Real consumption expenditure remains to be lower as compared to the earlier fiscal year. Okay, so private consumption is major concern. Now, the challenge before this year budget, the budget 2022 was placed in the midst of following distinct two challenges. What were the challenges before, we can say, this year's budget formulation? First challenge is specific to the pandemic and pertain to the need of undertaking policies that boost labor income and consumption expenditure. Now, we knew that the labor income is one of the concern. Simply we will say that the amount of wages that the workers are receiving in the economy, that we will say that labor income. And the consumption expenditure, when we talk about disposable income increases, that leads to consumption expenditure. So, these two, increasing these two was a major challenge. And second challenge pertained to addressing the structural constraints of the Indian economy that restricted growth even during the pre-pandemic period. Now, what we observed, especially after 2012-13, there is a decline in overall economic growth, GDP growth, and there are structural constraints in the economy which are proving obstacles for the economic growth. Okay, so addressing those structural constraints was also one of the challenge before this year's budget. Now, the writer of this article is of the view that on both fronts the budget has failed. Let's see how it has failed. First, we will talk about that labor income and consumption. As the fiscal consolidation path is adopted by the government in this year's budget also, how it is affecting. Let's see first. While share of revenue and non-debt receipts in the GDP has remained more or less changed. That means tax receipts, they have remained more or less unchanged. The objective of fiscal consolidation has been sought to be achieved primarily by reducing expenditure to GDP ratio. So, fiscal consolidation is not being done through raising the revenue. Rather, the revenue has more or less remained unchanged. Focus here is on reducing the expenditure. This year's budget. Some facts are mentioned here. The brunt of this expenditure compression fell on revenue expenditure. Okay, the brunt of this expenditure compression, that is focus here on reducing the revenue expenditure. Though the additional capital expenditure could be financed either by postponing fiscal consolidation process or by increasing revenue, however, the budget has sought to achieve fiscal consolidation by reducing allocation for revenue expenditure project. Now, revenue expenditure, especially when we talk about subsidies, so their allocation has reduced. Along with that, the second aspect, since the bulk of revenue expenditure comprises of food subsidies and current expenses in social and economic services, the reduction in allocation for revenue expenditure has been associated with fall in several key expenditure that affect income and livelihood of labor. Simply, we should understand, when the food subsidies and other subsidies are reduced, what will happen? The people have to do more expenditure, spend more on those food articles or those subsidized items, earlier subsidized items, and because of that their income levels again are fall, or because of that the consumption, private consumption also falls. Consumer goods, their buying is also less because of this. Okay, so this we can say, but there is general trend also. What trend we can see is there is reduced allocations for the social sector in past few years. Now, this year's budget, you can give the example of agriculture and allied activities, rural development. They registered a sharp decline in nominal absolute terms in this year's budget as compared to earlier year. Okay, so this thing. Then lastly, despite sharp increase in the profits during the pandemic by the corporates, corporate tax to GDP ratio has continued to remain below the 2018-19 level due to tax concessions. That means tax concessions have prominently increased in past few years. Rather, the profits of these corporates have increased also. So this shows that this is favorable policy to the corporates, but for poor, their welfare is to some extent ignored. जैसे फूड सब्सिडी है या बाकी भी सब्सिडीज जो है, like we talk about health expenditure, it is reduced. Education expenditure, it is also comparatively very less. So that's why we are saying that the corporates tax concessions are increased, but the welfare expenditure has reduced here. Now, what are the implications for the development spending? Now, implications, simply we can say that the development spending, especially for subsidies, food subsidies or employment guarantee schemes like MG Narega, expenditure in agriculture, rural development, social sector like health and education, it is getting affected as the expenditure levels, development expenditure levels will come down. The objective of fiscal consolidation, along with inability to increase revenue receipt, has posed the constraint on development expenditure. Because there will be pressure on the government, no? If it starts increasing the development expenditure, there will be fiscal expansion and the fiscal deficit will increase. Okay. there is also a trend of decline. You can mention this in your answer. Since 2008-9, India registered sharp decline in development expenditure ratio till the advent of pandemic. Okay, so even before the pandemic, there was trend of reduced development expenditure. Okay, so this aspect you can mention in your answer. Now, why is budget's fiscal consolidation approach is a concern from the macroeconomic perspective? Let's understand that. If GDP growth rate and revenue growth rate happens to be lower than what is projected, then actual expenditure can turn out to be even lower than what is projected. So simply we should understand that the projected growth rate, if it is not happening, automatically the expenditure will also reduce, because the revenue generation of the government also reduce. Then even if the actual expenditure is close to the budget estimates, the recovery of labor income and consumption expenditure would be largely restricted by the manner in which fiscal consolidation has been carried out. This is because reduction in allocation for development expenditure would have adverse impact on labor income and consumption expenditure. Okay, so development expenditure is having very huge impact on the labor income and consumption expenditure. Simply you should understand that when the government allocates for subsidies or the development, social sector development, so the extra income or expenditure burden on these services, goods and services, reduces on the labor, and they have more disposable income for the buying of consumer goods. This is how the consumption increases. Okay, given the fiscal consolidation strategy of the government, the prospect and extent of economic revival at present remains heavily dependent on external demand. External demand means exports. External demand means we are talking about exports. Although exports have increased up to, we can say, pre-pandemic level, but that remains the concern. Despite of limited recovery in exports in last few quarters, possibility of sustained economic recovery relying exclusively on export channel appears to be bleak at present, as different countries have already started pursuing fiscal consolidation. So other countries are also focusing on fiscal consolidation, and because of that, India's exports may not be that much competitive, or simply we can say the market for India's exports may reduce. Okay, so in this manner we should understand that exports are also not viable options. So what should be the government focus here? So focus should be on increasing the private investment and private consumption, and government needs to facilitate the private investment. Rather, the government is at present focusing more on public investment, as witnessed during this we can say budget. The focus is on PM Gati Shakti plan and infrastructure spending, infrastructure investment. Okay, so in other areas the government is promoting the PPP also, public private partnership, but the government should focus more on increasing the private investment, and that simply we should understand for that purpose the structural constraints. Yes, the government is taking measures like the environment clearance, land acquisition problems, taxation system should be streamlined, और जो हम IBC वाला जो गवर्नमेंट ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस पे रिफॉर्म्स ला रहा है काफ़ी सारी चीज़ें, सो दैट इज इन लाइन विथ रिफॉर्म्स इन द स्ट्रक्चरल कॉन्स्टेंट्स वी कैन से. Okay, so that should be focused more by the government. Okay, so this is the discussion from economy perspective. A disjointed response, editorial on page number 6. It talks about need of regulatory clarity on crypto assets. Now we know that in this year's union budget, finance minister announced 30% tax on all the transactions in virtual currencies, and the assets also, buying and selling of assets, and in addition to the applicable surcharge and cess on such transactions, and 1% tax to be deducted by buyers while trading in any virtual asset beyond threshold. Beyond certain threshold, there will be 1% deduction like TDS for income tax. The same manner this is going to be deduced. The only deduction permitted would be the cost of acquiring asset. So this is the only, we can say, positive thing for those transacting in crypto transactions. Otherwise the exemptions are not there. A consultation process is underway which will determine the legal position of such assets. Now at present there is no law which is regulating this crypto transactions or simply virtual transactions, no law, okay, or regulatory regime. The government is planning to bring law, but yes, whatever the bill that was there on the floor of parliament, so government has retracted from it, and maybe the new reforms will be there and the new bill will be presented in near future. So the government has not introduced the regulatory regime, but the government sought to tax those transactions. So this is from one aspect, positive aspect, it is going to increase the revenue of government, okay, through taxation. Second positive aspect you can mention here is that the transactions will be traced by IT officials, as these transactions will be there in IT returns. Okay, they have to mention now, they have to pay the tax, they have to mention these transactions. That means up till now what used to happen is there was no taxation, or the transactions were not in the formal economic systems. So that's why this is again positive development. Any kind of fraudulent transactions, or let's say there are concerns related to funding to the terrorist organizations, Naxalists, or yes, using for antisocial, we can say used by the antisocial elements or funding of such kind of activities. So that can be traced here, and we can say that can be stopped also. Also we can talk about, let's say, money laundering aspect. So this is very important as we can say initiative here, that to bring these transactions into formal financial system. Okay. Now what are the issues or challenges? Simply we should understand that along with this there should be some kind of clarity, legal clarity. Okay, legal clarity means there should be one law enacted by the parliament talking about what is particular virtual transaction, how these transactions will be regulated, what is the regulatory body, who is that authority. And we should also understand here that what about the status of international transactions in those currencies, because we know that virtual transactions are beyond the boundaries of the nation. So how they will be regulated, ये सारी चीजें हमें यहाँ पे चाहिए, regulatory clarity. Okay, so this aspect. Next thing you should understand that the government do not have the scope now to outrightly ban these transactions, cryptocurrencies. So earlier the RBI had sought to we can say ban these cryptocurrencies in 2018, but later on Supreme Court has stopped that regulation and said that you should come with certain regulatory guidelines instead of outrightly banning the transactions in cryptocurrencies. And that's why now the only available option is to come up with law, and that will regulate the whole transaction system. Also, the government brings that law, it is going to be good for India's startups. Okay, so they can, Indian startups can come up with innovative ideas and they can expand this particular economic system, a part of now the formal financial system. It can come up with good solutions also, and for that purpose the regulatory clarity is very important. Okay, then only these companies will venture into those innovative aspects. Lack of regulatory clarity is not going to expand this particular sector. Okay, so the government should at earliest should come up with this law here to regulate these transactions.
Sir, Sir, by taxing 30% is so much high. Is the government is planning to make the investment in Bitcoin to reduce, or what is their intention? Why they are taxing 30%?
Yes, actually, first, maybe because of, let's say, the kind of, see, first of all, when we are bringing them into the formal economic system or transaction system, so we need to reduce the bubble that it has created. Okay, and for that purpose, we need to deter the fraudulent or those speculatory transactions. Okay, and for that purpose, this higher taxation rate is implemented. And later on, maybe it may come down. Okay, after some years, after, let's say, regulatory regime and clarity in this sector, maybe that the taxation will come down, or there will be differential taxation on transactions, different amount of transactions. Okay, but at present, because of this reason.
Is there any relation with the GST? Will they add in under GST like this virtual taxes and all? No.
No, at present there is no scope, I guess. And second thing is that government itself is trying to come up with this central bank digital currency. So it will be in competition with those virtual currency, no? So government wants to promote this, and we can say deter the people to invest in cryptocurrencies. From one point of view, this is also, we can say, the motive of government.
Okay.
Yes, yes. Now, moving on. IS chief blows himself up amid US raid. So, yes, there was the US forces raid, and this has resulted into death of the IS chief. Okay, so Islamic State Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qureshi. So, he was the new IS chief after the death of earlier chief, or the first chief is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Okay, under his leadership, IS expanded to the larger areas of West Asia, the whole Gulf countries, and also some of the North African countries. Okay, and it spread also increased in South Asia, including India also. But in 2019 attacks, there was killing of this Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in the same manner that has happened with the present leader. Okay, so this is good development. Why? Because the US forces has been successfully able to reduce the expansion, or the, we can say, influence of IS, the terrorist organizations. Now you can see that what has happened here is the Qureshi exploded the bomb that killed him and some of the family members, including women and children. Now, yes, the death is a serious blow to the terrorist group, whose capabilities have been severely degraded and dispersed since the coalition forces destroyed their caliphate about 3 years ago. So, in 2019, you can see that this was the severe blow, and now we can see that the next leader is also dead. So, this is important in terms of fight against terrorism. Just have a follow up on this, because IS related, there was one question talking about radicalization problem in India through online media by IS. Radicalization, उस पे क्वेश्चन आया था हमें GS3 के ऊपर. So this IS was spreading the fundamentalist philosophy. It was trying to recruit the Indian youths through online, we can say, spread of their propaganda, and on the social media platforms or other such platforms, this propaganda was spread. Youth was radicalized, and they were recruited later on. They were leaving the country, they were going to Syria for the training purpose. Okay, so many cases were observed in India in different states, and because of that, the concern was here related to role of media, role of technology, that is that technological platforms being exploited by these terrorist organizations. Okay, so that's why the question was asked. Especially the direct presence is not there in the country, but some of the terrorist organizations, which are the frontal organizations of this IS are working in India. okay, these nascent organizations, they affiliate themselves to IS, okay, but they are nascent. No major attack is carried out by them up till now. Okay. Yes, Chandrayaan 3 set for launch in August. Now, this is also important development from science and technology, space science or space technology. Okay, so Chandrayaan 3 mission is a follow-up of Chandrayaan 2 of July 2019, which aimed to land a rover on lunar south pole. Okay, so let's find out some information about Chandrayaan 2. So this Chandrayaan 2 was sent aboard the country's most powerful geosynchronous launch vehicle, GSLV Mk3. Okay, so GSLV Mk3, the most powerful. Why we are saying that? It can carry more higher load, larger load as compared to PSLV. However, the lander Vikram, instead of controlled landing, ended up crash landing on September 7, 2019 and prevented rover Pragyan from successfully traveling on the surface of the moon. So, to some extent, the mission failed at that time, and immediately the government announced the follow-up mission to this Chandrayaan 2. Okay, now which were the components of Chandrayaan 2? Orbiter that will observe the lunar surface and relay communication between Earth and Chandrayaan 2's lander. Then lander called as Vikram and rover called as Pragyan. So lander will have the landing carrying this rover, and once it is landed, the rover will come down and it will travel on the surface. It will carry out some, let's say, information, take some information, and that will relay to the Earth, or we can say Indian laboratories. So yes, this Pragyan was a 6-wheeled artificial intelligence powered vehicle which will move on the lunar surface and perform the on-site chemical analysis. Okay, and this Vikram lander was designed to execute India's first soft landing on the lunar surface. Now, what was the objective? Primary objective of mission was to demonstrate ability to soft land on the lunar surface and operate a robotic rover on the surface. But talking about the scientific objectives, this was such kind of questions asked in the mains examination. Okay, so that's why it is important to remember scientific objectives. Moon provides the best linkage to Earth's early history. Okay, so that will help understand how our Earth was formed, solar system was formed. First objective. Second is evidence of water molecules discovered by Chandrayaan 1 requires further studies, and that studies was supposed to be carried out by Chandrayaan 2. Okay, so water, whether the water is there on the moon, and if it is there, then in what chemical composition it is there. So all these studies were required. And third is it will also study new rock types with unique chemical composition. So studies of rocks on the surface of the moon, again that will help understand the mineral composition. In future, if suppose the mining is required, so that may could happen in the important, let's say, minerals are there, important elements are there. So ये सारी चीजें हमें study करनी थी. Now why explore the lunar south pole? Specifically the south pole is targeted by some of the countries like US, Russia, even China. So let's understand the reason. So lunar surface area remains in a shadow which is much larger than the north pole, this south pole. There is possibility of presence of water in permanently shadowed area. Frozen water, possibility of frozen water in that region. South pole region has craters that are cold traps and contain fossil records of early solar system. So the first objective that will also help. This water वाला जो है वो भी objective हम बोल सकते हैं. And its regolith has traces of hydrogen, ammonia, methane, sodium, mercury, silver making it untapped source of essential resources. ये third objective. So you can see that all the scientific objectives are in line with why we are exploring this lunar south pole through this. Okay, and its elemental and positional advantages make it suitable pit stop for future space exploration. That's why also one of the reason here. Okay, so for prelims as well as mains examination, this is important information. Indian diplomats to boycott Beijing Games, Winter Olympics. So yes, Indian diplomats will not be part of inauguration here. So terming the China's decision to field PLA's soldier involved in June 2020 Galwan clashes as the torch bearer for the Winter Olympic Games in the Beijing as regrettable. India announced diplomatic boycott of the games just ahead of ongoing opening ceremony. Also, the state broadcaster Doordarshan announced it will not telecast opening and closing ceremonies live, where India has one athlete, skier Arif Khan, participating. Okay, so India's skiing, we can say athlete, he is the only participant, eligible participant in the Winter Olympics, and he is going to be India's representative there. So India has allowed the sports person to participate, but diplomatic boycott is there. Okay, so we should understand that the 2020 Galwan conflict that has happened, that created tensions between two countries. And in recent times, after overall, let's say many such border talks happened, commander corps talks, and then some de-escalation, disengagement has happened. Now China is again using that we can say event to further increase the tensions between India and China. So you should be having follow-up on this. Okay. Other countries have also boycotted, like UK, US, Canada. Diplomatic boycott is there, but it is due to human rights concern in Xinjiang and Tibet province. And Austria and Sweden, they have concerns related to COVID-19 protocols. Okay. Fine. So these are the important articles. Any question? Okay, then let us stop. Thank you.
Sir?
Yes.
Sir?
Yes.
Actually, who is deciding the Olympics to be happened in the countries? Who is deciding the Olympics?
Sorry?
Like this year China, next year, who is the authority for deciding this country to host the Olympics?
Yes, we have this International Olympics Committee. Okay, so they decide this. Olympic Association is there, no? IOA, International Olympics Association. So they have this decisions take.
Okay, like boycotting the diplomats, are they concerned of what the International Olympic Association saying? Like
No, it is not concerned. Simply it is ceremonial decision. Okay, nominal decision जो होता है ना, एक protest के लिए हम decision लेते हैं कि हम we are not participating in the inauguration ceremony.
yes, okay.
Okay, fine, ठीक.